Mr. President, we're grateful to the Chinese presidency for holding today's meeting. We highly appreciate the contribution of Beijing to multilateral efforts to resolve the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone. For more than 2 months in the Middle East, a conflict of biblical proportions has been raging. It would be no exaggeration to say that it has become one of the most lethal regional conflicts in recent decades. The statistics of casualties and victims are setting monstrous records. In less than 2 months' time, 1,200 Israelis and 15,000 civilian Palestinians have died, half of which are children. An unprecedented number of residents of Gaza since 1948. 1.6 million people have become internally displaced persons. More than 111 staff members of UN humanitarian agencies have died. We express condolences to all of the dead and wounded civilians in Israel and Palestine, and also the families of humanitarian workers who have died. We are deeply grateful to all of the humanitarian workers who every hour risk their lives to continue courageously carrying out their duty on the ground. As bitter as it may be to acknowledge, I'll be frank, their contribution to mitigating the consequences of this escalation for ordinary people is much greater than the one that the Security Council of the United Nations has managed to achieve over this time. And now is the time to ask ourselves how that could have happened. In response to the correct calls we've heard today for unity of the Council, I would directly like to touch upon a number of awkward issues for our Western colleagues that are fundamentally important for understanding the current situation. The first of which is the blatant double standards of Western delegations vis-à-vis the Palestinian people. And there are several blatant examples. How many times have Western delegations requested Security Council meetings on Ukraine? The answer is at least twice a month. The USA and Albania do everything they can to express concern over the political aspects of the crisis, and France and Ecuador are positioning themselves as fighters for overcoming its humanitarian consequences. How many times have these delegations requested Security Council meetings on the Middle East? 0. Colleagues, why are you being so timid? Or is it that the fate of the Palestinian population is much less interesting for you from a domestic political perspective in your capitals? These same double standards are something that we've already seen laid bare in the situation of the crisis of migration to the European Union, when Ukrainian refugees are given all sorts of benefits and preferences on the basis of the fact that they are allegedly used to that way of life at home, and refugees from Africa and the countries of the Middle East are kept in camps in inhumane conditions. Incidentally, yesterday in Ukraine, a serious scandal broke out after an advisor to the office of the President of Ukraine, Sergei Lyshenko, published a video of him from a nightclub in Kiev jam-packed with dancing young people. Ukrainians have been outraged by this from the point of view of the total mobilization going on in parallel, but I want to ask you about something else. After 2 years of our special military operation in Kiev, nightclubs are still operating and are extremely popular, but how many entertainment facilities are operating in Gaza? In truth, even asking the question is abominable in light of the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, food manufacturers, and civilian infrastructure in general. The residents of Gaza have nowhere to go to relax at this point. And my next question relates to children. Our Western colleagues express such hypocritical concern in front of the cameras about Ukrainian children, but they don't hesitate to besmirch Russia by circulating absolutely absurd and repellent rumors about their abduction. And all of this is while Russia is doing everything it can to protect children from the consequences of the Western-inspired Ukrainian crisis. What about Palestinian children? Secretary General Guterres has said that Gaza has become a graveyard for children. Those words would force any normal person to shudder. In the space of a month alone of the escalation in Gaza, more children died than in all conflicts in the last few years taken together. Every day in the enclave, dozens, if not hundreds of children die and are maimed. IDF strikes are hitting schools and hospitals. The basic rights of the child to life and health are being trampled. Now, distinguished Western colleagues, where are your appeals to the ICC for arrest warrants? Where are your efforts to create all sorts of investigative commissions and tribunals? Another telling subject is the situation of women. Western delegations pontificate at every opportunity about equality and demand that in literally every Security Council product we include the mantra about the need to ensure significant participation of women in political decision-making processes. They demand that the gender aspect be taken into account even in subjects that objectively have nothing to do with it, such as nuclear disarmament. Which women are you worried about? Judging by everything, it's clearly not Palestinian women. They have had even their most fundamental right taken away from them, the right to life and security. We all heard the chilling briefings of the executive directors of UN Women, Sima Bahous, and the UN Population Fund, Natalia Kanem, at the last briefing about the suffering of women in Gaza. And this includes types of suffering that, due to physiological differences, men don't have to deal with. Palestinian women in the enclave have to give birth in unsanitary conditions. Under bombings, they are subjected to major surgery without anesthetics and medicines. Western delegations in the Council prefer to shamefully keep quiet about this. Which of you then are supporters of the women, peace and security agenda? We only see hypocrites and unprincipled opportunists who, if required by political expediency, will turn a blind eye to any crimes and, on the contrary, will find them where they don't exist. Distinguished colleagues, over these weeks, one extremely unseemly fact has become clear. For the West, Palestinians are second-class people, defending the interest of which they simply have no interest in doing. This is the main cause of the problems that this Council has faced when coming up with decisions. For almost 2 months, the international community, humanitarian agencies, NGOs and ordinary citizens have been calling on the Council to demand that the parties immediately cease fire. Russia has been talking about this from the very beginning of the escalation. We first, back on the 16th of October, proposed to the Council a draft resolution saying so, and a few days later we proposed a second one. But this appeal has still not been acted upon. And yet, a sustainable ceasefire is not just a moral imperative, it is the only way of guaranteeing an effective humanitarian response, which simply cannot be carried out in the conditions of hostilities. The maximum that the Council has been able to bring forth over this entire time is the toothless Resolution 2712 about humanitarian pauses without any mechanism for monitoring its implementation. It's no surprise that it's not being implemented. Its initial positive message was, through the efforts of the USA, extremely watered down and does not contain a demand for a ceasefire, nor does it provide for practical measures to ensure broad and unfettered access to those in need and the provision of assistance to the suffering. It also left out the forceful raids of Israel on the West Bank and arbitrary airstrikes on Syria, as well as the rise in tensions on the Blue Line with Lebanon, which could lead to a further expansion of the crisis in the Middle East region. Representatives of the Israeli leadership, unfortunately, made full use of the US-provoked division in the Council and did not delay in calling that resolution meaningless, declaring their intentions to ignore it and continue their clearing of the Gaza Strip, after which there was further bombing of schools, hospitals, mosques, churches and UNRWA facilities. Colleagues, you all understand very well that this is an open violation of a Security Council resolution and Article 25 of the UN Charter. However, we've not heard a word of condemnation from you, and yet you would not have skimped on this in other country situations. This is a further demonstration of your blatant double standards. Of course, we cannot help but be pleased that as a result of the recent humanitarian pause and the exchange of hostages, people's lives have been saved. But these steps were the result of an agreement by players in the region and don't have anything to do with the aforementioned resolution of the Security Council. And that means that although this arrangement is providing a glimmer of hope, it is not sustainable nor comprehensive in nature. And in particular, it has not allowed Palestinians to return to the north of the enclave, and it does not cover Syria and Lebanon. And therefore, the main issue remains what awaits the long-suffering Gaza and other occupied Palestinian territories tomorrow. There is a high risk that in the absence of a precise, verifiable decision by the Security Council on a ceasefire, this short respite will be followed by a new cycle of violence, and Gazans that during the pause received assistance will die under the further shelling. The extreme likelihood of this most negative scenario is also indicated by the unambiguous statements of representatives of the Israeli leadership about their plans to continue, after the end of the humanitarian pause, their intensive clearing of the Gaza Strip. Therefore, it's important that humanitarian pauses and addressing the acute humanitarian issues facing the Gaza Strip become a prologue to a ceasefire rather than a de facto green light for Israel to continue the bloodshed in Gaza. There is one answer for the UN Security Council to adopt decisive measures in this regard that, unlike any bilateral arrangements, ensure a mechanism for international monitoring. As a first step, we expect that the Secretary-General, as stipulated in Resolution 2712, will, as soon as possible, present proposals on concrete options for organizing a mechanism for monitoring its implementation. Today, we heard from him about the creation of a working group to work on this issue. We would like to ask, how long do we have to wait for results from the work of this working group? One of the options could be expanding the mandate of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO. This mission has more than 200 military observers, the numbers of which could be increased and which could be deployed, provided that the necessary additional resources are provided. We firmly call upon the Secretary-General to work on this option or to propose an alternative. Distinguished colleagues, speaking about the tomorrow of this conflict, it's also time to think about the day after tomorrow. There are many questions about ways to rebuild Gaza and, in general, the future long-term solution to the Palestinian question. And without a solution to that, it will not be possible to ensure a truly sustainable security situation for Israel. Russia is actively working in this direction. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, recently held a meeting in Moscow with members of the committee that was created upon the decision of the 11th of November extraordinary joint summit of the League of Arab States and the OIC in Riyadh on the situation in the Gaza Strip. Having determinedly condemned terrorism in all its manifestations, the participants spoke in solidarity in favor of a rapid establishment of a sustainable ceasefire regime and ensuring the protection of the civilian population. We need to remain also focused on preparing for the relaunch of the peace process on the internationally recognized basis affirmed in the UN and underpinned by the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which was advanced by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and supported by all members of the League of Arab States and the OIC. First and foremost, this relates to the creation of an independent, integral, sovereign Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with a capital in East Jerusalem, which would coexist in peace and security with Israel. Clearly, in order to move towards this goal, alongside the efforts made to address the aforementioned acute humanitarian issues, a collective diplomatic mechanism will also need to be established. We are convinced that an important role in this mechanism must be played by countries in the region, Arab and Muslim states. The Quartet of International Mediators was essentially disbanded upon a US decision. As you know, they refused to work in this format. Unfortunately, it did not include representatives of the Arab and Muslim world. It included Russia, the USA, the European Union, and the UN. In order to compensate for that shortcoming, long before the current events, we have been calling for the Quartet to work in full coordination with the League of Arab States. Our Western partners, to put it mildly, gave this a frosty reception. Unfortunately, the UN did not take the necessary initiative in this regard. As a result, the Quartet was not allowed to carry out its functions as entrusted to it by the Security Council of the World Organization. An updated mechanism for external accompaniment for coming up with the conditions for a long-term, lasting settlement on the basis of the two-state solution must be truly representative and include those in the region who don't worse but rather have a better understanding of how to achieve a just solution that would be based on the agreed international legal and treaty basis. We stand ready to do such work once the flames of this regional escalation have been doused. Unfortunately, there's still a long way to go until that happens. Thank you.